Hello Year 13, welcome to another video on Christina Rossetti's 19th century poetry. This is for EDEXCEL paper 3. If you do find these videos useful, please let me know in the comments section, as it'll just give me a little bit of motivation to make some more to help where I can. So as I said on the last video, just make sure that this specification is the right one. Double check it with your teachers. As I've said, it's EDEXCEL A level for paper 3. The assessment objectives on this paper are AO1, AO2 and AO3. Just as a little reminder, even though AO4 is not explicitly assessed, this is still a comparative question. You still have to create a comparative response. So I would just factor in AO4 anyway in terms of your revision. So the poem that I'm going to focus on in this video, it's actually one of my favourite poems, is Maude Clare. So we'll get right into that now. So I'm going to do a reading of the poem, and I just want you to be thinking about what's actually happening in this poem. You might already know. I'll do a brief rundown after I have read it. So out of the church she followed them, with a lofty step and mien. His bride was like a village maid, Mud Clare was like a queen. Some Thomas, his lady mother said, with smiles, almost with tears, may Nell and you live as but true as we have done for years. Your father 30 years ago had just your tale to tell, but he was not so pale as you, nor I so pale as Nell. My lord was pale with inward strife, and Nell was pale with pride. My lord gazed on pale Maude Clare, or ever he kissed the bride. Lo, I have brought my gift, my lord, have brought my gift, she said, to bless the hearth, to bless the board, to bless the marriage bed. Here's my half of the golden chain you wore about your neck, that day we waded ankle deep for lilies in the beck. Here's my half of the faded leaf we pluck from the budding bough, with feet amongst the lily leaves, the lilies are budding now. He strove to match her scorn with scorn, he faltered in his place. Lady, he said, Maude Clare, he said, Maude Clare, and hid his face. She turned to Nell. My lady Nell, I have a gift for you. Though were it fruit, the blooms were gone, or were it flowers, the dew. Take my share of a fickle heart, mine of a paltry love. Take it or leave it as you will, I wash my hands thereof. And what you leave, said Nell, I'll take, and what you spurn, I'll wear. For he's my lord for better and worse, and him I love, Maude Clare. Yea, though you're taller by the head, more wise and much more fair, I'll love him till he loves me best of all, Maude Clare. So what is happening in this poem? Pretty shocking in terms of events. Obviously, this is set in the Victorian period, so we have a newlywed couple coming out of the church, and it appears that Thomas, who is the man in the union, his mistress Maude Clare, is there, and she calls him out very, very publicly on their secret relationship. So it appears that he's married another person, and she's obviously really hurt by this. Now his mother is also at the wedding, and she steps in and kind of undermines the situation and tells his new bride Nell not to worry, that this is just something that happens. This is a natural thing that happens. And Nell eventually turns around and says to Maude Clare, I know you're better than me. I know you are more beautiful. You are more intelligent. But I'm just going to love him until he loves me more than you. And that's essentially it. So we have this very, very public calling out. Now, this would be shocking even in modern time. Imagine being at a wedding and this type of scenario happens. So considering the Victorian era, it would be extremely, extremely shocking. So that's basically what happens in the poem. The themes that are coming out of this poem then are betrayal, the role of women, and I think the relationships between women as well. I think we could also probably say in there the double standards of society, but we will get to that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So let's have a little look at some context then surrounding this poem in particular. Now, this poem was published in around 1857 to 1858. It was written, and it was published in the 1862 Goblin Market Anthology. So Rossetti considers the roles of women within Victorian society within the poem, and contextually this is actually a reflection of the real double standards of society between men and women, and the behaviours that men were allowed to exhibit and get away with, but that women were not. And we'll get to that a little bit more in the behaviour of Maude Clare and how she damages herself by admitting to this secret relationship in a very, very public way. Now, Rossetti is was a very complex individual in terms of feminism and her thoughts on progressive ideas surrounding women. She did not typically express sympathies with the plight of women, so she is complex when considering her actual opinions. She didn't believe women should get the vote. She didn't support the suffragettes. But again, we will get to that as and when the time is right. But just 1 year after writing this poem and 3 years before its official publication, Rossetti actually began volunteering at a place called the Mary Magdalene Penitentiary for Fallen Women. And here she worked closely with women who were prostitutes and women who'd had children out of wedlock. And through this, she certainly became more concerned with these double standards that faced women within society. It was quite common for upper class women to start volunteering and helping in these types of institutions. It was, in this time period, and it was all under the guise of religion. It was about getting these fallen women on the right track in the eyes of Christianity. But her sympathies to these kinds of women can certainly be seen in later poems, so it is important to keep this in mind. And when this was written, I do think she seems quite sympathetic to and it's quite a social commentary on the unfair nature of the treatment of women in society versus what men could get away with. So again, just to expand upon that, the role of the women in the Victorian era, it was basically you remain virtuous until you are married. Your worth was based on your virtue. You become a wife and a mother. Women could not legally divorce their husbands and were expected to be completely domesticated. So no matter what the husband got up to, no matter what the husband did, the woman was not actually allowed to leave him in the eyes of the law. And certainly an outspoken woman was not a desirable woman in the eyes of society during this era. So this makes Maude Clare a really shocking character. She would have been a really shocking character for this period of time, and she certainly fits a certain type of archetype of the scorned woman that we often see in literature. So Rossetti is playing up to some of those stereotypes, but I think when you look beyond the superficial meanings of the poem, there is a little bit of sympathy there for the situation that Maude Clare finds herself in. So let's look at form. Form came first for Rossetti always, and in considering that, we have to consider the deeper meanings of the form that she chose for each poem. So this poem is actually in the form of a ballad. Traditionally, ballads were written to make a moral statement, tell a popular story, or to celebrate or attack certain institutions or people. And in the bullet pointed section here are some of the features that we can find in ballads. So we've got simple language, stories, we've got stanzas, repetition, dialogue, and a third person objective narration. Now all of these things are within here. What you could do is you could add the meaning of, say, the dialogue and the third person objective narration. That makes it very much a social commentary. The fact that we've got this omniscient person who's quite detached from the situation emotionally, it is giving us a social commentary. If this was from the perspective of Maude Clare, it would be maybe more emotional. If it was from Thomas, it might, Thomas seems quite meek and mild in this, but if it were from Thomas's perspective, we get an entirely different perspective of the situation. So what moral statement might this poem be making then, because it is in the form of a ballad, or what institution might it be actually attacking? Now, to say that Rossetti would attack the institution of marriage is interesting because she was a devout Anglican. So she was extremely religious. However, she herself passed up many opportunities to be married. She was never married. She did have the option, but she turned down, I do believe it was 3 suitors. So this is really interesting to consider, and this is why she's a very complex person. So you can say that her personal stance and personal beliefs were ambiguous when you are in your exam or when you're doing your assessments. You can say that these things are quite ambiguous as to what she really feels, but it does appear that there's a little bit of a mockery on the institution of marriage, and she's making a moral statement about the way that men can behave, and they don't necessarily have the consequences or repercussions that women do. Okay, so these two images here are entirely contrasting, and there's a reason for that. So if we break down the title of the poem, which is called Maude Clare, Maude directly translates to battler, and Clare is masculine. So we have a masculine name here. We have a woman who is named as if she is going to go into battle, and she has masculine connotations. She is not defined as a character within this poem as the stereotypical female of the Victorian era. She might be stereotyped as the scorned woman, but she does also have these masculine elements. So let's have a look at the characters that are actually in this poem. We've got Thomas, who is a central figure in the poem, but we don't hear too much from him. That's quite symbolic. We've got Maude Clare herself, who is super powerful, very outspoken, but she commits a social suicide in doing this because she highlights the fact she is not virtuous. She highlights the fact she has been someone's mistress. This is going to render her as somewhat damaged in the eyes of society. We have Nell, who is the very passive, submissive stereotype, I suppose, and we have the mother of Thomas, who props up the whole idea of patriarchy and minimises the situation that they all find themselves in. So it is important to consider all of these characters. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the voices in the poem. Now, when we get more than one voice, one piece of dialogue, or one character speaking in a poem, that is called heteroglossia. So heteroglossia means that there is more than one person speaking in the poem. So we have a couple of characters that have dialogue within this poem. Again, this is quite standard to the form of a ballad, but it is important that we do get these different voices because we're able to see the different perspectives, even though it's not coming from the speaker. So we have a look at the voice of the mother here. So we've got, your father 30 years ago had just your tale to tell, but he was not so pale as you, nor I so pale as Nell. So we've got some loving reassurance from the mother of Thomas here, but she's highlighting an age-old issue. Men have always had the freedom to become involved with a variety of women. She is suggesting that her husband, who is the father of Thomas, did the same type of thing, but they weren't as distraught, embarrassed, feeling as awkward as Thomas and Nell are in this situation. So really, really normalises the situation. And it belittles the issue that this newly married couple face. It's not something to worry about. This is a common occurrence. And this is almost reflected in the rhyme and pattern of the poem. We will get into more detail with that, but it's quite joyful. You know, when you read that, we've got, it's monosyllabic in terms of the, you know, you, Nell, tell. It's quite simplistic. Yeah, it's quite upbeat and it's quite joyful. It doesn't really reflect, it's a huge contrast in the rhyme and pattern to the content as to what is going on. And this is quite interesting because it's symbolic of the fact that Thomas's mum is pasting over this issue. So she is seen as a voice in the poem who is able to really act as a pacifist in the situation. This is not a big deal, don't worry about it. And then we've got Nell's voice. So if we have a little look at Nell's voice, and what you leave, said Nell, I'll take, and what you spurn, I'll wear, for he's my lord for better and worse, and him I love, Maude Clare. And then it goes on to that second stanza as well. Okay. Now, Rossetti very interestingly uses marriage vows within Nell's dialogue to show the principles of marriage. The vows of marriage do suggest that no matter what happens, you stand by your spouse, so in sickness and in health, and it says for better and worse. So we have a direct reference to these biblical religious vows that are a part of the institution of marriage. However, what is quite interesting is that the reference to these vows in such a scandalous situation can be viewed as a mockery of the supposed ideal of marriage. And this is highlighting that marriage is not actually blissful at all. This is their wedding day. This should be their happiest day, if we were to go with the stereotype. They are going to enter into their marriage in scandal. And yes, Nell is standing by him, but the fact that these vows are highlighted in such a scandalous situation would suggest that this is a little bit of a mockery of this ideal of marriage. She is standing by him for better and for worse, but is that actually a good thing? Does he deserve that? So I've said here, like, what are the similarities between Nell and the mother of Thomas? Both of these women in this poem are very submissive to patriarchy and to the behaviours of Thomas. They normalise his behaviour, they rationalise his behaviour, and they accept his behaviour. Now, the consequences of accepting his behaviour are far greater for Nell. However, we do learn from heteroglossia that his mother suffered the same thing. Yet both of them are very, very passive in the face of patriarchy, whereas it appears that Maude Clare is the one who challenges the patriarchy. And it's very, very interesting because we've already looked at the fact that she is actually in essence, she is masculine through her name. Okay, so what we're going to do now is have a little look at the representation of Maude Clare. Now, if you remember what I said at the start, one of the features of a ballad is quite simplistic language. The diction within this poem is relatively simplistic, but it doesn't mean that we can't still analyse some things in there. So I've highlighted in yellow the representation of Maude Clare. Now that's going to be our starting point, okay? So if we look at her behaviour, she's got a lofty step and mane. Maude Clare was like a queen. My lord gazed long on pale Maude Clare. He faltered in his place. Lady, he said Maude Clare, he said Maude Clare, and hid his face. I'll love him till he loves me best. So the representation that we have of Maude Clare, or the idea that we have of Maude Clare, sorry, from the representation of her, is that she is regal. There is a use of a simile there that she is like a queen. She's powerful. She's got a lofty step. She follows them. She's assertive. My lord gazed long on pale Maude Clare. He's staring at her. Gazed has got connotations of being mesmerised, of almost being in love. He's just married someone else, but he's gazing for a long time at Maude Clare. When he tries to speak to her, he falters in his place. He addresses her as lady. He's referred to as Lord, my lord, throughout, by both Nell and Maude Clare. And he addresses her as his equal. She is like a queen. She is a lady. Lords and ladies go together. And he can't even look at her. He can't look at her because, assume he's embarrassed, but also because she is so powerful. And then at the end, Nell says, I'll love him till he loves me best. So there is an insinuation there that he loves her. So through the use of diction and characterization of Maude Clare, we've already got it through her name, but she is regal, she is powerful, she is assertive, and she's challenging the status quo of the situation that is going on here. And this is achieved through very simplistic diction, just through very simplistic similes like a queen, and through her interactions with the other characters and through the dialogue of the other characters when they address her. Now, similarly, what's important to consider is the juxtaposition between Nell and Maude Clare here, because we've got his bride was like a village maid and Maude Clare was like a queen. Now, he is a lord, so we assume that Nell is marrying up in terms of social status. Maybe that's why she sticks with him. If she is like a village maid, she is paling in comparison to Maude Clare. And this gives the question, Does he really want someone who is his equal, or does he want someone who can be his subordinate? And that gets into the whole power dynamics of the patriarchy here too. And there is this juxtaposition through the characterization and description of Nell and Maude Clare. Nell is polite, she is quiet, but she does still have a resilience and she is still quite strong. She does stand up to Maude Clare in quite a passive way, but she does accept the behaviour of Thomas, whereas Maude Clare does not. But we definitely, through the diction and characterisation of these, in terms of status, in terms of beauty, in terms of intelligence, Maude Clare is presented as higher ranking than Nell is. So this begs the question then, well, why would he not just be with Maude Clare? Why is he going to be with his bride, who's like the village maid? Also, really important to bear in mind is that Nell is denied her name in that first stanza. That's quite powerful. We've already seen Maude Clare's name twice by this point. It's the title of the poem. We know it means masculine, battler. Then it's in the first stanza, and Nell doesn't have it. The first time that obviously we hear Nell's name is from the perspective of the voice of his mother through the heteroglossia. And that's significant because that denies Nell the voice, which can also reflect her passivity there as well. We get foreshadowing in the representation of Nell and Thomas's mother. The way Thomas's mother is behaving in this situation, with this having happened to her, we can pretty much guarantee that this is the route that Nell is going to take. And this is symbolic of the cyclical acceptance from women. Now, if we look at the pronouns in this, if we look at the titles in this, we have lots of reference to social status. We've got my lord, lady, Maude Clare, Nell. This is a man of high social standing, of high social status. His wedding is covered in scandal, but we don't get the impression that there's going to be much of a consequence for him. And if we look at each time he is addressed by the women, there is this reference to my lord, my lord. So he's a powerful man, yet through his dialogue, he cannot address Maude Clare with looking her in his face, in her face. He's faltering when he tries to speak to her. So through the use of his title and social status, Rossetti highlights that this is a powerful man, but he pales in comparison to the power of Maude Clare here too. And this is what makes me feel she is somewhat sympathetic to the plight of Maude Clare and almost commends the notion of standing up for yourself in these situations as a woman. So this is again where it gets quite complex, because she is toeing the line of the stereotype and Maude Clare is quite shocking, but when you look a little bit deeper, it does appear that she is portraying Maude Clare in quite a positive light as well. So if we actually look at the love of Maude Clare and Thomas, because even though Maude Clare is powerful, she does still love this man, or she did love this man, and this is why she is there behaving in this way. So if we have a look at the phonetic devices that are used when she starts to speak to Thomas. Here's my half of the faded leaves we pluck from the budding bough, with feet amongst the lily leaves, the lilies are budding now. Got a lot of plosive sounds in here to reflect Maude Clare's anger and the pain that she feels, and we've got juxtaposed diction, which also conveys the hope of the relationship. If we look at budding and how that is the antithesis of fading, and there's plucked, all of these things, there's a mixture of beginnings and endings in here through the diction that is used. Now dissonance and cacophony is created in this stanza through the use of the repetitive, fricative and plosive sounds. So this can reflect the uncomfortable nature of the situation, and it reflects the pain of Maude Clare herself. Okay, and this is where it gets quite interesting too, to consider the actual relationship between Maude Clare and Thomas. I personally feel that Thomas loves Maude Clare. When he talks to her, he's nervous, he sees her as his equal, and he tried to match her scorn with his own scorn, but he couldn't because he was ashamed. And there is an insinuation throughout the whole poem that what they had and what they experienced was quite special to the both of them. Yet he's gone with Nell for whatever the reason is. Is there a societal pressure? Is this on men to pick a woman that would be accepted by Victorian society and those stereotypes? And that is important to consider when you're thinking about Rossetti's intention behind conveying Thomas in this way. And I've put here about the lilies are budding now. What could this phrase mean? It's very, very ambiguous. It's almost like a threat. Lilies are budding now. That's like a start of life. So this is quite an ambiguous phrase, and you could explore that a little bit more. Is it that she is she pregnant? Is there something more to this situation? It does leave it very open, and it does leave it very ambiguous, and this steeps her in shame because she is an unmarried woman and she has been his mistress. Now, going back to assessment objective 3 and the pre-Raphaelite movement, Rossetti was obviously, as I discussed in the last video, a part of the pre-Raphaelite movement. Now, tragic love within the pre-Raphaelite movement was a concept explored through their paintings. Rossetti herself has created tragic love within this poem, but it's in a slightly different way. Instead of these people being separated through death or exposed in an admiration from afar, she shows the tragedy of a broken love. She shows the tragedy of betrayal and what that can do to a person. So there are a lot of things that play here when we think about context and when we think about the representations within this poem. Now, the poem is laid out in quatrains the whole way through. It's very, very, very consistent. So it's a ballad and we've got quatrains the whole way through. Now, what we could say with regards to that is that these remain consistent throughout the poem as a reflection of the unwavering support and the unconditional love of Nell for Thomas. She is still by his side at the end, just as she is by his side at the beginning. This doesn't change. What does change is the rhyme scheme somewhat. We go from having tetrameter to trimeter lines and stressed syllables. And this just takes away from the rigid sort of meter and pace. And that can be a reflection of the awkwardness as well of the situation. Now, with this section of the examination, because AO3 is so important to understanding the whole, and that's why the exam board want you to study an entire anthology, because you see the patterns and the motivations of a poet through this. I always like to ask my students when we're studying this poem, do you think Rossetti would have married a man like Thomas herself? Would Rossetti have been more like Maude Clare? Would she have been more like Nell? I would hazard a guess, based on the background of Rossetti, that she would not have married Thomas. Do I think she would have been as outspoken as Maude Clare? Maybe not. But the fact that I think she aligns more with the views of calling out this behaviour makes me think she's challenging that behaviour within society at the time. And it is always important to draw upon Rossetti's motivations and how she would behave or feel in these situations herself, because then we can gather a lot of her opinions too. So just to sum up, this poem is a ballad. One of the features of a ballad is to have quite simplistic diction. However, through the heteroglossia within the poem, we do get to see different viewpoints, but we have a very detached speaker. There are a lot of sound devices used throughout. Structural features are used throughout as well. What I would recommend is to go back through, look at the speech of Thomas as well, because there's lots of enjambment and caesura that conveys the emotion. There's lots of plosives, fricative sounds, which creates dissonance and cacophony. And it is a social commentary on the things that were happening to women during the time. And it looks at the role of patriarchy and how the Victorian gentleman was not always what he seemed. If you have found this useful, please let me know in the comments section, and I am going to get working on some more videos as well. Thank you.